Apparently, Courtney Love was in Faith No More briefly, and the story is something like she went to a show and saw them and then demanded to be in the band, and slept with one of the guys or something. I don't know what the exact story is, but here she is, and this is some type of cable access show. And judging from all the comments on this YouTube channel here, this footage has been fairly recently released from Oblivion, wherever it was. Surprisingly good quality, actually. And I wanted to juxtapose the sound that you hear with Faith No More in this early era, '84, with Southern Death Cult a year before this in '83, because I wanted to show the similarities. I mean, obviously, Southern Death Cult had a lot more conviction in what they were doing, because they were right. They were in England, where the goth movement, or I guess post-goth or post-punk or whatever you want to call it movement, that was kind of the center of it. But as we spoke about in the first and second blogs here, Courtney Love actually went to England, and kind of like she was injected right into the center of some of the quote-unquote, happening bands in the new wave, post-goth scene. So I just find it interesting that we kind of get that same tribal, experimental, weirdo, kind of trancey, hypnotic sound in this band that she's trying out for, presumably that she had nothing to do with the music. She just sort of showed up. And if you notice, everyone in the band is, although they all look kind of kooky, they're all kind of composed and competent in their musicality, and kind of looking at each other and nodding. They all kind of know what's going on. But Courtney's like this kind of freak, just sitting there, kind of like, all right, let's see what Courtney does. Almost like this kind of feels like an experiment almost. And on one hand, you can applaud it and go, wow, that's experimental music. I appreciate that. That's art. On another hand, it feels kind of like a laboratory, more in the sense of, what if we put these elements together? What will this do? And what effect will this have on the audience? How can we affect the minds of the people out there? What do we want to do? And if you notice this symbol back here, this is an occult symbol. Now, I don't know if the band intends it that way, but it's an octagon, but it's two squares off center from each other. And in one presentation, Jordan Maxwell, who's an expert in occult symbolism, he calls this the Freemasonic double square. And he basically states that the first square represents order, as in fair and square. We met on the level and we parted on the square in, Masonic terminology. But then the second square, which is off center, it represents chaos. So it represents order and chaos and control over both in some occult symbolic circles. So just interesting that they're using this symbol so prominently and so early in their career. And we see Courtney Love kind of writhing around and, pulling these flowers through her toes and stuff, and her fingers look dirty and kind of looks like she's got like little wounds on her fingers, and she just looks nuts. She looks like this weirdo they just pulled off the street, and she kind of looks like she's going to tear her dress off any moment and writhe around like some, sexual object. And, given all we know, all we've gone over in the other blogs, I mean, you can see this is a real, this person is not necessarily acting. I mean, it's performance art or whatever, but she is obviously a highly damaged, sexually damaged person. And, you might walk into a club in 1984 and see this and go, wow, this is impressive. This is, I need to know more about this. I need to buy the album. Or you might say it's trash. You might say it's horrible. Apparently, a lot of people disliked her and hated this. But the point I'm trying to make is, the mystique we get from Courtney's character here. I think that a lot of times people mistake this fascination for the mystique of people like her for basically looking at a damaged person who's been terribly abused and shattered emotionally. What is this fascination we have with it? Is it wrong? Is it right? She's not even 21 here, I don't think. These are musical icons. This is the stuff they're made of. If you want to check out the written version of this blog, Acid Music Mindcrime Part 3, you can find it at batshitcave.blogspot.com. So in this first part, now I picked up a couple books since the last two blogs I did. One is written by Linda Carroll, Courtney Love's mother, and the other one was written by Hank Harrison. So I'm going to be quoting a lot from those books because there's a lot of interesting information in there that was not in the previous two blogs I did on this topic. So Linda Carroll's talking about when she met Hank Harrison. She's wandering around on Haight Street in the 60s, and she wanders into this party or this house somewhere, and this is what she observed. He reminded me of a professor giving a lecture to young beatnik types. From their enthralled gazes, I assumed he must have been saying something compelling. He wore an Irish cable knit sweater, its wool the same brown as his hair. I thought he looked like a scarab beetle, heavy-bodied and oval-shaped, with glittering eyes. Drawn closer, I heard him talking about his job as a psychologist and his years studying esoteric literature. He claimed he had occult wisdom, knowledge that could save the world. Hank had the uncanny ability to take a tidbit of information he'd picked up somewhere and turn into a full-blown discourse, sounding so expert that it was difficult to separate fact from fiction, fact from fantasy. His favorite topic was William Blake's idea that our social conditioning blocks true perception. Brainwashing, he called it. And about LSD, Hank said, "This isn't a drug, it's a sacramental medicine." He described the psychedelic drug as if he were both its creator and priest. Yet I began to see glimpses of other sides of him. I caught him lying, bragging about knowing somebody he didn't know or about having a job I knew he never had. He rarely carried cash, and he let other people buy him coffee, meals, or tickets to events. Money is coming, was his mantra, and usually the money came from me. He stole, too, from the homes of friends at parties and get-togethers. Despite the connections and talents he boasted about, Hank could not maintain most of his friendships or find a job. Worse, his history of bad debts began to catch up with him. Hank wasn't at the hospital when Courtney was born. He said he was doing business, his mysterious phrase for activities I knew not to ask him about. One day, a check arrived in the mail from the New American Mental Health Center. I applied for a grant. I'm going to open a center for people on bad LSD trips. Later that day, I imagined an LSD center in our house, people hallucinating around my baby daughter. It was his eyes that scared me the most, hot embers of pure rage. So my impression is that she paints a picture of a man who is perhaps well-meaning, but with sociopathic tendencies, at best. At worst, he comes off as a sadistic narcissist, con man, possible member of a secret society, and or a participant in clandestine operations. And here's what Hank said about himself. When I was young, I was a juvenile delinquent. I stole cars. I ran away a lot. I went into my dad's pockets and stole money. My dad went to the 1936 Berlin Olympics. My uncle invented the talking baby doll. He, my dad, was doing infiltration training, and he blew his shoulder up on purpose so he wouldn't have to go to Europe to kill Germans. I studied with a guy named Saul Alinsky. Alinsky taught me a lot, and he taught Obama a lot too. So we're in the same framework organizing. I've always thought of myself as a rich beatnik, a minor member of a Royal San Francisco cast. And here we have a couple quotes from Saul Alinsky. He said that true revolutionaries do not flaunt their radicalism. They cut their hair, put on suits, and infiltrate the system from within. And here's a picture of Hank Harrison. Now, on this documentary Etched in Acid, they say that he had done, like 75 acid trips. And now here he is suddenly in a suit and short hair and looking clean cut. So I just think it's interesting that considering this quote from Saul Alinsky, is that what he's doing? Is he trying to infiltrate something? And Saul Alinsky had very worked out ideas about, how to manipulate society and how to make big changes. He thought very big. I haven't read a lot of his stuff, but we'll talk more about him in a moment. Hank said, I had to tell all of Courtney's friends, don't go near Tom Grant, man. He's a cop. If you're a hippie or an old beatnik or a black guy, and you want to get prejudiced, it's cops. Grant spent a lot of time trying to screw me up, man, career-wise. Grant was really upset about my criminal record. Grant is a real conservative guy. I won't use the N-word, but racist, somewhat, I guess. And by the N-word, I think he means Nazi. So Hank's really laying it on thick about this Tom Grant guy. Now, if you've looked into the whole, if you've seen the film Kurt and Courtney, and you're into the whole, Kurt Cobain death conspiracy, which I believe there was a conspiracy there, a legitimate one. But Tom Grant was hired by Courtney Love to find Kurt Cobain when he quote unquote disappeared. As you may have seen in the film Kurt and Courtney, or Tom Grant's own documentary Soaked in Bleach, he quickly started to become suspicious that Courtney Love was actually involved in Kurt's disappearance and probably his death too. So, and obviously Hank Harrison, he wrote a whole book about how Courtney Love was involved with Kurt Cobain's death. So it's just kind of interesting the way Hank Harrison really seems to dislike Grant and tries to paint him out to be this almost neoconservative, neo-Nazi kind of guy, really laying it on thick in a way that's kind of hard to buy, especially when you see interviews of Tom Grant. He comes off as very reasonable and a very genuine kind of guy. So it's just, it makes you wonder if Tom Grant has something on Hank Harrison, and what we see is his reaction to that, and he's trying to do his best to make Tom Grant look bad so we don't take him seriously, because Harrison seems to be threatened by him in some way, which I just think is interesting, especially considered that Hank Harrison comes off as a lot more full of shit than Tom Grant does. So this guy Saul Alinsky that Harrison referenced, he wrote a book called Rules for Radicals, a practical primer for realistic radicals. If you go to Amazon and you read some of the reviews, and you don't have to sit there and cherry pick. You can just read right through them, and this is the kind of stuff you see. Taking a Knee is a great example of what this book is all about. Hope and change really means divide and conquer. Now I understand why race relations have never improved. Another reviewer said, it's always nice to have the enemy's playbook. If you don't believe it, just read this. The far left radicals have been using these tactics on us for 40 years. I think that Saul Alinsky is disingenuous when he represents the views of communities that he was never a part of. A Scary View into a Warped Mind, a must-read too. Read the book and burned it. If you want to know what's really going on in this country, read this book. And then there's this quote from Hank Harrison. Some people got shot at Altamont. See Gimme Shelter. That's a documentary about Altamont. So I moved back to California to see if I could apply some of Alinsky's principle to the rock and roll world. Think about that for a second. How do you apply? I mean, you want to insert far left radicalism into rock and roll? What does that mean? How does one actually do that? And he's got a lot of these pictures with his daughter Courtney that just look really disturbing and kind of inappropriate. I mean, look at the look on her face, look at him. And Part 2, The Brainwashing of Courtney Love. Quotes from Hank Harrison. I saw that I could not reverse whatever brainwashing she suffered, so I just made my peace with it. When she was little, she was wonderful, very, very intelligent. I gave her an IQ test. She has a 150 IQ. Her IQ is higher than I, because her mom's is higher than I. I have a thing called photographic memory. Well, I passed it on to Courtney. She can remember stuff that she told the cops or that she told A, B, or C 10 years ago, verbatim. And I told her about it when she was a kid. I have no doubt she was put through some kind of new age brainwashing. Frank didn't understand her deeper levels. She had a high IQ and a photographic memory, and Frank was grading on a class curve. Frank was her stepfather, her mother's second husband. It was only years later that I learned they were brainwashing her. I always knew Jack Reese was manipulating events from behind the scenes. He liked doing that. He was, after all, Sicilian, but whatever they were doing, they didn't want me to know about it. At the time, I had no idea they had already been using the baby for a hedge fund worth millions. Jack Reese was Courtney's mother's alcoholic, sexually abusive adoptive father. They brainwashed her immediately after they got her. She was told that I was dead, but the real motive behind it was they thought I had some claim to the money. It turns out the lawyers that were running the adoption, it wasn't really an adoption, it was a takeaway. They were Catholics too. He's making reference to the fact that Linda Carroll's adopted parents were Catholic, and Linda was raised Catholic. I tried to probe her memory to see if she recalled any fragments of the days when she and I were allowed to be happy. I did grab Courtney more than once, and it didn't work. I'm a failure at that. Courtney's a pure sociopath. It runs in our family, by the way. I'm not saying I'm not either. You know, I didn't do anything evil. My kid got screwed up, and she grew up to be kind of a witch. I'm not putting her down, but witches are necessary too, I guess. During the time she was estranged from me, her mother had completely programmed her. She told her I gave her LSD. She told her I was dead. He was alleged in court, I don't know if it actually happened, to have given me acid, she said, Courtney that is, and gone around boasting about it, like some biological experiment. Harrison again. Jack Reese knew a judge named Raymond J. O'Connor who helped me land a job at juvenile hall. But it was a dreary gig, especially the orphanage. I won a grant from NIMH and started planning the LSD rescue project. I was in graduate school in psychology at SF State and working as a night counselor at juvenile hall when Linda and I filed for what was supposed to be an amicable divorce. As part of the psych program, I was working with concepts of crisis intervention and was rescuing people from bad acid trips, as well as hanging out with a bunch of starving rock musicians who turned out to be the Grateful Dead. In weeks, I became the first psychedelic ambulance driver. When she was a toddler, I let her run around San Francisco State University, free as a bird, with me watching, of course. He's talking about Courtney Love there. So this part about Hank getting a job at juvenile hall and that he got it because Linda's father, Jack, adopted father, knew a judge and got him the job, and there was an orphanage, and this is all very strange because Linda doesn't mention any of this in her book at all. She wasn't with Hank very long. They were only together for, a pretty short period of time. And it's especially strange considering that Courtney ended up in juvenile hall, a few years later when she was like 11 or 12. And in and out of like orphanages and foster homes and all these like sexually abusive people everywhere. And it's just kind of strange that Hank seems to be already in that system that Courtney ends up, we think, randomly happening into. Hank gets very defensive about, the accusations that he dosed Courtney. And if you read his book or you watch interviews of him, this comes up a lot, and he always makes a big point out of it, and how he took a lie detector test and how that's proof that he didn't dose her. But Linda has this quote in her book about Hank saying, "He spoke to me like one speaks to a patient in a mental hospital." He seems to have had direct connections with those producing LSD in the 60s, those distributing it. He took part in controlling the public perception of the drug and its culture via the CBS documentary Etched in Acid that we've talked so much about, and then personally laying hands on those overdosing from it, which he innocuously called LSD rescue. So Hank's a really strange guy. I don't know if we even know the half of what his real deal is. And he continues the narrative where the Reese's left money to Courtney, and that Linda didn't want Hank to get a piece of it, and that's why she tried to erase her memory of Hank. So he's basically projecting all of the kind of mind control, brainwashing stuff all onto Linda, and giving the excuse that she was simply trying to prevent her from having a relationship with Hank because of this money. You get the sense that this is purely, Hank's invention, but who knows? But I think there is some validity to the idea that, Hank needs to project all of the abuse of Courtney onto other people. Hank had Courtney one night a week and every other weekend. One day she came home with psychedelic magic marker drawings covering her arms and legs. This is Linda from Linda's book. And I was horror struck by her nightmares after the visits with him. She woke up screaming, "No, Daddy, no." It was virtually impossible to soothe her afterward. The more I tried, the more she would stiffen, arching her back and resisting as though my touch were painful. Courtney grew from a toddler into a little girl and became adamant about not wanting to see Hank. She came home from her visits looking pale and exhausted. I went back to my lawyer. Is he still writing all over her? He asked. Yes, and her nightmares are even worse now. So, Linda has a much more restrained style with her writing. Hank's writing is just nuts. It's kind of all over the place. But Linda comes off as a lot more convincing just because she's more restrained and proper, and her book's actually really good. I was quite moving. I don't know if I believe a lot of it. A lot of it could be bullshit, but it's just a lot easier to take her seriously because she comes off as a lot more normal in her writing. Anyway, here's Hank's response to all that. She felt I would harm my child because I brought her home in an agitated condition. This was true. We played hard. But also, Courtney never freaked out when I came to pick her up. Only when I brought her back. What does that tell you? Now, this is a very strange quote because it doesn't really seem like Hank quite understands how he comes off here. Because, he first he says, this is true. What's true? That he harmed his child? That she was in an agitated, why was she in an agitated state? He says, we played hard. Well, what the hell does that mean? She's a child. This was like the first few years of her life. I think, probably when she was 5 years old or younger. So what do you mean he played hard and brought her, and he kind of like, it's all okay because she wasn't agitated when he picked her up. She wanted to go. Well, maybe he had her programmed, that doesn't prove, this doesn't help his case is what I'm saying. It just makes it worse. And his statement about how he's a sociopath, this kind of backs it up. This is something a sociopath might say because there's a lack of awareness in it, about what's normal with a child. Quoting Hank again, I saw Linda swing the baby on the A train platform almost as if she wanted to toss the kid onto the tracks. She hated Courtney, the spawn of the only pagan she ever married. Okay, he's calling himself a pagan there. And this thing about how he says she hated Courtney, this is an interesting statement because in Linda's book, she talks about how Courtney yells at her saying, you hate me, you hate me. So according to Linda, Courtney did have it in her head that she hated her. And I just think that's very interesting that Hank kind of echoes that programming in her brain, that my mother hates me programming. Did she believe this because there was something wrong with her from birth, or did she believe this because someone put it in her head? That's my question. Because I think there was a lot of programming going on with Courtney, and Hank basically corroborates this in great detail. He just doesn't allocate any of that abuse to himself. He allocates it to other people. This was an interesting interview from YouTube that I quoted in the other blogs. I had read in your book that Linda subjected Courtney to some Stanford experiments. Harrison's response was, I don't know if they were Stanford per se, but there was some kind of Oregon State bunch too, don't forget, Oregon box, Reich. They had this thing about reparenting, Reikian psychology. They were doing tarot reading, firewalking, hatha yoga, Raja yoga, running on no food, that kind of stuff. It was Portland. It was back in the day, you know. They were just as bad as the Haight-Ashbury. I mean, wasn't nothing different about it, except it was Oregon. I don't know what they were exposing her to, but it was, oh yeah, they gave her pills. Tuinol, which is the blue and the red pill, sleeping pill. It's a hypnotic, truth serum type of thing. Seconal, Tuinol. And they were getting her to try and erase me from her mind. And I found out that the reason they were doing that, they thought I was after their money. And at the time, I didn't even know they had the money. All right, so we're talking about the Jack Reese, the Reese's money again there, okay? And look at all that detail that he went into. You know, first he dodged the question. You know, I don't know if they were Stanford per se. And then he doesn't say anything else about Stanford. He launches into this Oregon thing, and he talks about all this crazy stuff they put Courtney through up in Oregon. He wasn't there. He said that they transferred guardianship, stripped it away from him, and gave it to Frank Rodriguez, Linda's second husband, and went up to Oregon without telling Hank and just stole her and went up there. And this is all according to Hank. Yet he knows everything that was going on up there, you know, and all these drugs she was taking and this weird Reikian therapy she was subjected to. Now, this Stanford thing, there's a lot of weird stories about Stanford. You look this up, different things that occurred there, but there is evidence that Hank had a presence there. According to dailyentertainmentnews.com, Hank has attended postgraduate classes in anthropology and various seminars at Stanford. And Ken Kesey also had connections to Stanford. And if you remember, we talked about the acid test, the first few Warlocks Grateful Dead shows where they were just dosing people. And Ken Kesey was putting those on, those acid tests. While a writing student in Stanford University, Ken Kesey undertook paid psychological experiments with mescaline and LSD. He also began working the night shift as an attendant at a psychiatric hospital. These experiences came together in his first novel, One Flew Over Cuckoo's Nest, which explored insidious ways society represses nonconformity. And you may have seen the film version of that with Jack Nicholson. Bill's folks are attorneys. Sure, of course. Bill was working when I first met him at Stanford Research Center. That's a quote from Hank Harrison, according to deadsources.blogspot.com. And I think Bill is a member of the Grateful Dead. So the point is, he was at Stanford doing these weird research and psychological experiments. So, you know, what is this thing about Courtney and you know, experiments with her? I mean, you'd think that since Hank is so defensive about people accusing him of abusing Courtney, he would be quick to debunk this thing, this suggestion that the interviewer made. But he doesn't try to debunk it at all. He just right turns into a completely different direction and goes on a big monologue. And here we have this diagram talking about the Reikian Therapy. I wanted you to see this because if you haven't heard of Wilhelm Reich and the Orgone Accumulator, I mean, this is very interesting, but it's way out there. And Hank is saying that they subjected Courtney to this. And this was all about sex. This was all about harnessing the orgasmic energy in the body. And, you know, I'm not going to say that some of it isn't very fascinating and maybe even invalid, but, you know, Wilhelm Reich, you know, he was influenced by Sigmund Freud, and it's known that Sigmund Freud was taking amphetamines and kind of losing his mind, and you know, this whole sexual aspect just gets very questionable. And here's the box here, the Orgone Accumulator. If you watch 60s movies, and you'll see this pop up in movies and even in music once in a while. Anyhow, this is very weird, and he talks about, like, you know, starving Courtney and it's, you know, walking on hot coals and tarot cards, and it's just so crazy, everything he brings up. But the question that I don't think Hank wants you to ask is, well, how do you know all this, Hank? Like, and how do you know so much about all these drugs and stuff? You know, he tells these stories kind of like he's trying to sound natural, like, I don't really know. Let me think, you know, let me jog my memory here. Oh yeah, it was Tuinol, you know, like almost like he's play acting a bit, like he's way more involved than he's letting on. And again, Hank says this was all done to erase Courtney's memory. You know, I mean, that's a very serious accusation. Erase someone's memory. I mean, that's straight out MK Ultra kind of talk. You know, and Hank just throws it out there over and over and over and over. But it wasn't me. I wasn't doing it. I wasn't part of it. I just knew all about it. I just knew every detail about it. And here's a picture from Linda Carroll's book, and I think this is up in Oregon. There's Linda, there's Frank Rodriguez, there's Courtney, and the two girls that that Linda and Frank had. So they were Courtney's half sisters. So Del Non, Courtney's godmother, I guess, shuttled her back to Oregon, where she was placed in foster care, supervised by Linda's weird shrink friend, Richard Farr, the guy who, according to Courtney, broke up Linda's second marriage. She told me Dr. Farr molested her, but I doubt this because she once told me Frank Rodriguez molested her. By all accounts, this Dr. Farr character, if that's his real name, tried to brainwash my kid. He gave her Tuinol, Seconal, and other hypnotic downers. Moreover, he used marginal techniques on her. I believe exposure to so much pseudoscience broke her spirit and created in her a destructive and even homicidal personality. All right, so if you recall in the last blog, I insinuated that Frank may have molested Courtney, and I think that it may have even have been, as disturbing as it sounds, consensual. Because Courtney says, oh yeah, Frank was a great guy, and Hank Harrison doesn't seem to have a bad word to say about the guy either. But I didn't want to push it because maybe I'm wrong. But now we've got, in Frank's book, he says that Courtney told him that Frank molested her. So that's not me saying it. That's Hank Harrison saying it. Although he denies that it's true. Well, if it's not true, why did you bring it up, Hank? And there is an interview where Courtney Love talks about a quote-unquote new therapist that her mother got that was a pervert and had porno pictures on the walls of his bathroom. And I'm thinking, well, is this the Dr. Farr guy that Hank Harrison is talking about? I mean, it's all just so crazy. At least 2 more times in the book states that Frank did not molest Courtney. So it's like, on one hand, we're supposed to believe that Linda was this, cruel lady who just wanted greedy and just wanted the money that was, passed down to Courtney to avoid, taxes or whatever. And she just stole her away from Hank and, took her like a thief in the night up to Oregon and stole Hank's legal guardianship and gave it over to her second husband, Frank Rodriguez. And they just went up to Oregon and it was all very nefarious, And yet Hank has nothing but nice things to say about Frank. And it even sounds like he's corresponding with Frank during all these years where he supposedly didn't have any contact with Courtney. And he really wants to keep Hank's name clear of this molestation thing. So it's just kind of there's contradictions there. I don't think we're getting the truth there. All this brainwashing and mental physical abuse seems to create what Harrison decides is Courtney's shattered homicidal personality. All right? Now, that's very serious wording. Homicidal personality. I mean, he's insinuating that, all this abuse that's happening only from Linda, of course, is breaking her down and turning into this homicidal person. So what it seems like he's doing here is he's building a narrative that, Courtney's abuse led to her homicidal tendencies, which caused her to kill Kurt Cobain, or at least, cause it to happen in some way or another, facilitate the killing of her husband. And the important takeaway here is Hank goes out of his way to make sure that he's not responsible for any of the abuse. He didn't contribute. I wasn't the evil one. So it becomes obvious that what he's doing here is he's trying to blame everyone else for scrambling her brain, because if people start thinking that he was the one scrambling her brain, well, that kind of implicates him, doesn't it? Maybe even possibly in the murder. Would he be out there, writing a book called Love Kills: The Assassination of Kurt Cobain if it was just very obvious that he was the one abusing her and he was the one brainwashing her and he was the one, turning her into a homicidal personality? After we were reunited when she was 14, Courtney often went to bed screaming into her pillows. At first I thought it was something I did or said, but when I confronted her, she told me her mother put her through some kind of wacky gen-off regime. Around that same time, 1979, I started to realize that Courtney wanted to be a rock star at any cost. She was trying to rebuild a shattered personality. Who shattered her personality really, Hank? Was it Linda or you, or was it both of you? And then, okay, and she's like this self-actualized person at this point, this shattered young girl. And she was trying to rebuild a shattered personality by trying to be a rock star, trying to be famous. If you change this to, I was trying to rebuild a shattered personality, maybe Hank shattered her personality so that he could rebuild her and turn her into whatever he needed to turn her into. If you read it that way, it kind of explains everything here. Everything makes a lot more sense. And here's a picture of Courtney in front of that repurposed chicken coop we talked about in the previous blogs, which I guess they call this a ware, W-H-A-R-E, down in New Zealand. And it looks nice enough, but it's just kind of weird. They kept her in this separate building behind the house, like she was some animal that needed to be restrained. Part 3, the rock and roll mob. If you've ever seen Goodfellas, one of the most well-known mafioso movies ever made by Martin Scorsese, there's this character in it played by Joe Pesci, and he's like talking shit and shooting people and killing people and just acting like a total asshole all the time, and he gets away with it. And it's kind of like this stereotypical character like you see in the old Bugs Bunny movies or the old mob movies. There's like this stereotypical little guy with the high voice that's kind of like the mob leader, the gang leader. Well, why is Joe Pesci getting away with this? Why is, how does this happen? He's little. Why don't they just kick his ass? Well, because he's got backup, as they would say. He's got posse, as they would say in the hip hop lingo. He's a made man. When you're a made man, that means that you're untouchable. They can trace your relatives back to the island of Sicily or whatever. So this means that no matter what you do, the mob is going to back you up. So when you have that kind of backup, yeah, you're going to act like a tough guy. The only stipulation there is you're not allowed to cross another made man. And that's exactly what Joe Pesci does in the film when that guy says, like, go get your shine box, because he knows Joe Pesci can't do anything because he's also a made man. But he can't contain himself because he's such a loose cannon that he goes up there and he kills the guy. So then Joe Pesci ends up getting whacked because you're not supposed to mess with a made man like yourself. So in a sense, I think Courtney Love is a quote unquote made man. She's part of some type of culture or rock and roll mob, because this whole thing about Kurt Cobain, which I'm not going to go that into because there's plenty of other people already going into it. Tom Grant did that whole documentary, Soaked in Bleach. Go watch it. There's so much evidence and so much people say, it just seems so obvious that she was involved. Even if she wasn't, what is very obvious is that there is a will to not pursue this, so that alone raises red flags. If everyone in the neighborhood is accusing you of molesting the kid across the street, I mean, something's going to happen. You're going to get in trouble. Someone's going to take you to court, whether you did it or not. But here's Courtney Love. Everyone in the freaking half of the people that are fans of grunge believe that she was responsible for Cobain's death. Yet nothing happens to her. The only explanation is that she's a made man. I mean, she's cuckoo. Look at her. She's nuts. I mean, I don't mean to be cruel here, but, where does she get this kind of power? Why is she so untouchable? She's a made man. It's the only explanation. She was about 11 when she first entered the system and 16 when Miss Rubio helped me bust her out. From that point on, she knew she was going to wreak havoc on the world. I knew this because she told me several times. So here's Hank Harrison again, going out his way to build up this narrative, that, Courtney planned it all way ahead of time, when she was younger. She planned it years in advance. But the thing he goes to great lengths to avoid is implicating himself in that plan. I mean, what if this was Hank's plan? What if this was Hank's boss's plan? You know what I mean? And they're just pinning it all on Courtney. But nothing's going to happen because she's a made man, right? In late 1979, I sprung Courtney out of juvenile hall in Salem, and she came to live with me on the houseboat in Capas Marina in Sausalito. By Christmas, she was running around San Francisco on her own. By Christmas 1979, she was commuting back and forth from Sausalito to her stepfather's house in Portland, using Friends and Green Tortoise druggy bus as her main ex-urban transport. She also made a slight side trip to Japan where she danced in clubs, lost her passport, and had to be rescued. But by that time, I was on my way to Ireland. In the winter of 1979, Courtney arranged a deal with her mom and got a whole bunch of money paid out twice a year. After that, I hardly saw her. Courtney and Frank stood me up for Christmas and New Year's 1979, and it hurt. But her first gig to Japan, the gig that resulted in several abortions, again by her own admission, took place in 1979. In Portland and on the road, Courtney's early traumas turned her into one of the worst kind of hookers, a fag hag or a fruit fly. All right, so this trip to Japan, what the hell was that all about? Went down there to dance? I mean, you hear stories about this, people, girls going to be escorts in Japan and things like this. I mean, she comes back having to get several abortions and she almost got trafficked. I mean, something real crazy happened down there, Was she sent down there to get trafficked? She was only like 15 or 16 years old. I mean, what was she even doing down there going dancing? I mean, I know it was a different time, but, this is not right. And Hank just tells this story casually. He doesn't seem hurt at all. Like, oh my God, my daughter almost died. My daughter was raped. Like, he doesn't seem emotionally scarred at all. He's just talking about like, yeah, then she went down to Japan and, had to have several abortions and almost got trafficked like it's some movie that he just saw the other day and he's just telling you the plot, Here's a strange picture of her that is in China or something. What's she doing here? Walking the strip? Being a whore in China? What is this? And here we see lyrics to a whole song called Teenage Whore. She's talking about it in her song. And here she is in, I believe this was England. She's doing the whole goth new wave thing. When she went over to Liverpool. And this picture here is kind of sad. It kind of looks like she just got done, prostituting herself. I mean, look at the look in her eye. It's very sad. And now she's got this different look here. She's going blonde and she's all dolled up. Attracted, she said, by the prospect of attending Trinity College in Dublin, the 17-year-old traveled to Ireland in 1981 to visit her father again. He said they lived together there for 7 months and got along fine. His daughter said the visit lasted barely longer than a couple days. He beat me up so badly I had to call the cops, she said. All right, so that's one story that's out there about Courtney's visit to Ireland to see her father. Here's Hank Harrison again. Courtney arrived in Ireland around her birthday in 1981. Robin's arrival was a good thing. That's the girl that's in these pictures up here. That's Robin Barber. And he says they were bisexual. Robin's arrival was a good thing. She was quiet, beautiful, and serene. I kept all the ticket stubs. I have the exact day Courtney arrived, the exact day Robin arrived, and the exact day they left for Liverpool. I had no idea they were bisexual. It's like Harrison's keeping records of all this, documenting everything. Like he has some big file somewhere. Courtney took off to Letterkenny with Steve O'Leary of the Belfast CIA Observers Group, a nice guy she met at my winter solstice party. In February 1981, Courtney sailed for Liverpool with a small group of weavers traveling home from Scotland for an early spring break. She wound up taking LSD with Steve and his brother at Ockenden Venture, a CIA cutout acting as a refuge center in Surrey near London. I think she also slept with Malcolm, the defrocked Anglican priest who ran the place. So again, they took off to Scotland and Liverpool, and Hank didn't go with them, but yet he knows everything going on. I mean, are they just reporting back to them like, oh yeah, then we took acid, then we hung out with your CIA buddies, then we went to the CIA cutout place, then I banged this priest guy. I mean, how does Hank know all this? He just knows everything that's going on with her, whether he's with her or not. And what is the CIA stuff all about? I mean, look up this place, Ockenden Venture. I looked it up. It's a real place. I mean, Hank talks about stuff that's real and people and places and dates, but and that's what makes it hard to know when he's exaggerating or when he's flat out lying, because he does seem to throw in a lot of factual stuff. I mean, it sounds like he's like spilling the beans on some CIA stuff here. So after Courtney leaves Ireland and does acid and gets on a boat with some CIA guy and goes to some CIA cutout refugee center, she ends up in Liverpool in 1982. She's just 17 years old. She's with Robin Barber, her friend there, and they're grouping around, and I guess somehow they end up on Teardrop Explodes tour bus, and Courtney ends up hooking up with Julian Cope of Teardrop Explodes, who apparently a few years ago was quoted as saying that he thought that Courtney Love should be shot. I don't know what the context was there, but it was, it was a website I saw with a bunch of people quotes about Courtney Love. So she invites them to stay at House Devonshire Road in Toxteth, which was in some ways the epicenter for Liverpool's thriving 1980s music scene. And Courtney's got LSD popping out of her ears. Bill Drummond said he was first aware of her in 1982 as this loud American girl with LSD. So she's being loud, she's got acid, she's tripping her brains out with her buddy. They hook up with an up-and-coming band. They're kind of staying in this place that's the epicenter of the scene. I mean, it's just kind of curious how they just end up right in the middle of everything, and they're just these drugged out, whatever. I mean, yeah, let's be realistic. Guys, they want groupies. They want to have sex, but I mean, they don't want their careers to be ruined. They don't want just like completely messy, messed up, whores from other countries just crashing in on them. Or maybe they do. I don't know. I never had the luxury of being in that position, but I don't know. There's just a very calculated look to the whole thing. It just seems very unlikely, especially when you consider the weird photos earlier and how it kind of seems like Courtney was groomed for this, that it wasn't just her own will. Like, I have to be famous. I need to go to England. That's where things are happening. I mean, okay, on a certain level, I could sort of buy it, but she just seemed too messed up to really accomplish all that, even with the money she was getting. Now, MK Ultra gets brought up in one of these interviews with Hank Harrison, and it's the only place I ever heard him mention it. The reviewer basically asks him what he thinks about the idea that MK Ultra might have been involved with Courtney's, quote unquote brainwashing. And Hank said, MK Ultra is pretty future thinking, but I don't think they got that big a crystal ball. I don't really know what to make of it, but it is interesting to note that the host who asked him the question about it goes on to say, yeah, I think that's silly. I don't know why people bring that up, as if it's some absurd, way out there suggestion that there might have been some MK Ultra involved, which made me think that the interviewer might have been, the interview was maybe made to sound real, but was really just kind of scripted to tell the story a certain way. That was just my impression regarding that question. Courtney didn't have any place to live. She was broke, so she moved in with us, with Kat Bajellin from Babes in Toyland. Steve Jobs used to hang out at my house. Dan Kobke, who invented one of the keyboards for the original Macintosh. Every once in a while, we'd run into that guy that looks like a Neanderthal, Wozniak. I hung out with all those people. If you remember the blog I did on serpent symbolism, I mentioned Steve Wozniak, who was a Freemason, and he also invented the first personal computer. It wasn't Steve Jobs, it was Steve Wozniak. And it sold for $666.66. She met Kat up in Oregon, and she brought her down with her. Babes in Toyland. Babes in Toyland used to rehearse in our basement. She used to live with us in '83 in Menlo Park. That's the Silicon Valley. They're at the heart of it. And the reason she moved to Menlo Park, Silicon Valley, was because all of her hooker friends were balling rich money engineers. We had a nice house. I worked for Honeywell. I worked for Lockheed. I worked for Applied Materials. I worked for Apple. I became senior editor of a magazine called Dr. Dobbs Computer Journals. In 1985, she led a continuous stream of junk-addled riot girls around and just set them up at my house like it was a crash pad. Yeah, and you didn't say no, Hank. You just kind of went, okay. He's just enabling the whole thing. She wanted to go to the Mabuhay Gardens all the time, and she wanted to go up to a place called the Vets. Get stoned on a thing called China White, which turned out to be fentanyl. We had to bring her down off of a couple bad acid trips. She would stay with us. We gave her a room upstairs in our attic. And she would bring her friends by, and all of her friends were like already very famous, like L7. And they were busy digging up money on the side. I won't say how. They got into my wallet. They scammed me a little bit, but I was chauffeuring around. Dad would drive them up to these obscure nightclubs in the city. Then they would not come home, and so I would go home. And the next day or two, they'd show up at the house and steal all my books and stuff like that. She was always a groupie, always on the scene, and she always got me to drive her, whichever one of the clubs she was at. The Green Tortoise became a sex, drug, and rock and roll vending booth for Courtney and her pals. They would get on the bus with pills and pop off the other end with pockets full of cash. From 1982 to 1986, she stayed with us in various states of penury and consciousness. During one of her visits in 1983, she told me she was on her way to LA to start a rock and roll band. That year, she attended concerts at Mabuhay Gardens, hung out with the Dead Kennedys and Black Flag, and usually had me chauffeur her around. By 1985, she was gone again. Black Flag, that's kind of interesting because Greg Ginn of Black Flag is a big Grateful Dead fan. There's pictures of him wearing Grateful Dead shirts. And I'm sure that came up when he was talking with Courtney, if they were hanging out together. It seems pretty cut and dry here. Courtney is on some sort of mission to infiltrate the punk underground rock scene. Whether it's through drugs or sex, by his own account, Hank sets her up at his home base with her hooker friends, acts as her chauffeur, contributes financially, and probably collected as well. Is this what he meant by applying Alinsky's principles to the rock and roll world? What was the purpose of all this? Look where Courtney is today, and perhaps you can fill in the rest. So on November 28th of last year, 2021, I got a couple emails from Google saying that they're going to age restrict some of my content, specifically the Chris Cornell video I did where I look at the evidence and the official investigative report. Okay, fine. It's a little graphic, I suppose. Maybe you should be 18 and over. So they blurred out, the main image and put, you got to be 18 to watch this, and I just looked at it now, and now it doesn't look like it's there. So I don't know what's going on. But anyhow, they also sent another email that same day saying, hi there, we're reaching out to see if you're okay because, we want to make sure you're not suicidal or whatever. I'm not even talking about myself at all there. I'm talking about Chris Cornell and the fact that the media jumped to the suicide narrative within 24 hours before all the evidence was even in. So that's what I was talking about. So it's obvious these aren't humans that are making these decisions. They have these algorithms going out there and just censoring things first, and then they might go back and double check it later and uncensor it. So it appears they may have unblocked the 18 and over threshold, but I don't know. But what's very interesting about the timing here is on this same date, I hit 300 subscribers. And I got this little alert like, congratulations. And there was a picture of a trophy. Well, now look, this is today. Okay, this is right now, real time. 299. All right. All of a sudden, I started losing one or two subscribers ever since that day. And look at this. This is a 3-month, 90-day analytics. And look at this big drop. Guess what date that was? November 28th. So that same date they sent me that email, all of a sudden my viewership dropped. So clearly they censored my channel on that very day. And ever since, it's been getting completely censored. And my subscribers, it says plus 48, but that's an average of the last 90 days. That's mostly around this time. It's dropped like crazy. So I'm out of here. I'm done with this. I mean, I'm going to stick around because I've got subscribers here. I want my content to be seen, but I gotta go. I gotta go elsewhere. So I'm really encouraging you people to please join me on Rumble. It's a great new platform. Um, it's not as popular. It's going to get more popular, but it's not as bot ridden and censor ridden. So I'm inviting you to join me there. I'm Joe Gilmore without the E on Rumble, and I'm going to be uploading all my videos there as well. And when I get enough people over here at Rumble, I'm just going to pull the plug on the YouTube page.